Hello, everyone. Can somebody confirm me that you can hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. How are you?
Fine, and you?
So, fine. Starting here. First of all, thank you for all to all the attendees and welcome. Thank you for being here for providing us this little time slot. I'm really proud to be here with two professionals, two very big professionals, and mostly friends of mine. First one. Well, you can make a lot of jokes about my language skills because they are called the same from my point of view. They are both Paul. The first one is my colleague in Sony, Paul Cameron. And the second one is Paul Torrents. So we are between very techie colleagues, and simply what we want to share with you is some little tips, some little tricks, some things that maybe you are willing to get a replay about. Bear in mind that you have a little box on the right side of your screen through which you can make questions. Obviously, we have received plenty of them. In fact, we have a list that we will use as a little script. And these are typical questions that probably nowadays, according to the lineup that we have, the state of the art that we have in this environment, they are very likely to appear in our sessions, in our conversations with you. So firstly, Paul Cameron, my colleague, belongs to the training department. He's the guy with the red sweater. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself, Paul, or maybe you need to unmute yourself, because after playing a video, automatically you are muted. So no, we cannot hear you. Maybe we can work on the audio issues. And meanwhile, let me also introduce he is an ICE from Sony, independent certified expert from how
okay,
long?
can you hear me now?
15.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. So if you want to introduce yourself before we go with Paul Torrents, maybe you can tell some lines.
I think it's one of those things that we have to get used to in the last year since we've had lockdown, is the bloody mute button. I think it's become the bane of all our lives. So my apologies for not having any audio. It's one of those things that we have to get used to now. Yeah, Paul Cameron, I've been with Sony now for too long to remember, about 26 years. And I can remember training on tape was when I started with Sony, training people how to maintain their tape machines. And what has happened over the last couple of decades in broadcast is amazing. And the cameras we're going to be talking about today, we wouldn't have dreamed of when I started with Sony. And some of the subjects I think we'll be discussing really quite exciting from the days when I used to work with tape. So yeah, that's me, and hope we have a good discussion today.
For sure. And about Paul Torrents, as I was saying, he has been ICE with us for more than 1 decade. He's Sony ambassador, but probably the most important thing, he's DOP, probably one of the most influential ones, not only here in Spain and in Latin America, but probably throughout the world. If you are not following him, I strongly recommend to follow him. We will talk about our social media during the webinar, and in the end you will have the links for that. But I can say proudly that I have worked with him many times. We have announced many cameras, especially during the last 2 years, especially. And maybe you can tell something about you, because obviously for me there are no enough words. And maybe we can see something from you after that. Okay.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be with your company, because I know Alvaro for many years, but also Paul, and we also travel a lot with Paul Cameron. So I'm so happy to share this time with both of you. And the thing is, I work as cinematographer most of the time. I've shot 9 movies as DOP, but I also shoot like hundreds of commercials, plenty of music videos, TV programs, documentaries. I'm a member of the Spanish Society of Cinematographers, and also Imago, which is the Federation European, member of the Spanish Academy of Film, and the Catalonian, well, a lot of associations. I mean, and I'm really very into filmmaking as a state of art. So today we're going to talk a lot about technical stuff, but I'm also want to talk a little bit about the art behind the machines, because most of the time we talk about cameras and sensors and pixels and numbers, photo sight, things like that. But behind of that, there's something for achieving communication between people. So that's my goal for today, and we can show a little bit of my work if you want. It's not not an updated reel, but it's a recent reel where you can show you can see commercials and stuff from movies that I shot.
Okay, let me play it.
Okay, go ahead.
Takes a bit of seconds. If any of you don't see anything, maybe it's due to your platform. So don't worry, it takes 2 minutes. So let's take a look on it.
Okay.
And so thank you very much, Paul, for providing us this reel.
Mm-hmm. Welcome.
Sorry, I was muting and unmuting. The typical thing. So I think it's a very nice warm up, because we can see what we have heard a lot in the last times about the cinematic looking pictures. That is something that we can discuss a lot about, and probably we will retake or recall that term in during this conversation. But now, if you don't mind, let me share a little guide, let's say, that I would like to show you, and just to know in which terms we're going to develop this conversation. So can you see, for instance, Paul, any of the polls, the slide, my monitor?
Yeah, but I don't see you.
Okay. Yeah, well, maybe
okay.
I stopped sharing my camera. Yeah,
we're welcome.
Probably now it's coming back. Okay. Yeah. Let us insist that you can make us any questions, provided you are polite enough. I mean, we don't want to start any war with competitors, with people angry because in some game in PlayStation they had some problem. That is not the leitmotif of this session. Obviously, we are going to give some, I hope, useful tips or tricks or advices about how to shoot. And now we are going to revise this part. As you have seen, especially in the last 1 year and a half, we have mostly renewed our whole lineup in the large format sensor area. So 1 year ago, I remember that the FX9 had just hit the market. We were starting to distribute that in January last year, and since then, many things have happened, as you can see here. There is a new, let's say, family that we will talk about. It's the cinema line, but now probably Paul Cameron, in this case, maybe you can continue with this little guide here. Okay.
Do I have control of this presentation?
If you tell me to go through it,
okay.
I will do it.
So if you click through, those are the ones that are cinema line. If you go back one, there is a kind of transition. The cameras in the middle, the FS5, FS5 Mark II, and the FS7, they have been discontinued now officially, but there are still, as you can see with Alvaro there are still an awful lot of people using the FS5 and the FS7. The basic difference with these is that they are based on the Super 35mm sensor, which I'll show you in a minute. But we are moving towards full frame. It doesn't mean that Super 35mm is worse or anything like that. It's still a perfectly good format, and ultimately it copies the original Super 35, the original 35mm film format that we used to use with conventional cinema movie cameras. But the newer ones that have come along since, well, there's the Venice, which is our high-end camera. This is real cinematography, top of the range cinematography camera. And the FX9, a relatively new camera, and the FS6, the smaller one, which is kind of equivalent to the FS5. But all of these have got a full frame sensor, so 36 by 24mm full frame sensor that comes from stills cameras. It's the large sensor that we come from 35mm film. Just go back one, Alvaro. It's that little camera in the bottom right-hand corner that's a bit of a surprise, because that's come along recently and has a full frame sensor as well. So it is part of the cinema line range of products, those 4 you can see there. But a lot of people compare this to the Alpha stills cameras, the A7 series. And there is quite a lot of comparison to be had with that. But this one is designed for taking movies, whereas the Alpha 7 series are designed to take photos, but it will take movies. This is designed to take movies, but it will take stills. So there isn't the little eyepiece at the top. It's got a fan built in, so it can take long shots without overheating or anything like that. So yeah, let's carry on, look at the sensors. And there you can see the sensors that we are using in all of these cameras. And if you click again, you can see that where these sensors are used. Just go one step ahead there, Alvaro.
Yep.
And there you can see just taking out all the electronics, you can see the actual size of the sensors themselves. It gives you an idea of the comparative size. And if you click again, you can see where these sensors are used. So it's popular for small camcorders, stills cameras at the bottom, 1/2 inch and smaller. ENG camcorders traditionally use 2/3 inch. And these are really popular for the ENG kind of use. They're relatively easy to focus, triple sensor, and produce a really good image for broadcast, general broadcast use. But at the cinematography end, we're using the Super 35mm, and these have been popular with some of our earlier cameras. But now we're moving towards full frame. And the advantage of that, if you click again, is the more control over depth of field. And that's one of the really interesting craft aspects of this, which we can discuss some more. The bigger the sensor, the more control you have over depth of field. It doesn't give you depth of field. You have to do a number of other things. You've got to have a large aperture and so on. And the scene has to be set to take advantage of it. But having a full frame sensor is one of those things that you really do need if you're going to get that really short depth of field. So if you move on.
And also, let me say that, for instance, during the last, let's say, 5 years, we have experienced how many broadcasters, despite they were traditionally in 1/2 inch or 2/3 inch, sensor size, have been at least combining it with Super 35. And now we can even see in some sports production, in American football, in European football.
In fact, this weekend were the Oscars. The Oscars were shot live with an F55, with many F55 in Super 35.
Yep, Super 35. So as time passes, we see more and more, let's say, sensor size mixing into the production. At least that is what we have perceived from the manufacturer point of view. So it was quite surprising, especially in the beginning, obviously. Sorry, Paul.
I think one of the things that large full frame sensors gives us is the flexibility. And certainly Super 35mm sensors are really good, but going up to full frame gives us more space. So this shows the formats for Venice. I'll start off with the 6K 3x2 full frame, 36x24mm. And there you can see the 4K 17:9, the DCI 4K. So that is the area that a Super 35mm sensor would occupy natively. And you can shoot both 4K and in Ultra HD, DCI 4K and Ultra HD natively on the Venice, and that's the amount of space it takes up. But there are other formats. And if we open up those other formats, these are the two anamorphic formats. And we'll talk a little bit about anamorphic. There's 6x5 and 4x3. They're kind of a square frame, but these are appropriate to anamorphic lenses. And I'll show you in a moment how these work. And then there's the other full width formats. There's the 6K 1.85:1. There's the 17:9, 16:9, and finally the 2.39:1. And these are various different heights, formats using the full 6K width. And that really is useful when you're going into post-production. You can crop into the frame, and eventually it'll be downsized to a DCI frame to display on cinemas, or if it's going to be released as a Blu-ray, it'll be down to Ultra HD. But it gives you the flexibility of that frame, that resolution, that quality that you can then go into post-production and do exciting things with.
Also here, let me tell people that there is a parameter called the crop factor that affects a lot to all this part. I mean, for instance, if you are using a full frame sensor with a Super 35 or APS-C lens, you won't cover the whole sensor. So you will see a very strong vignetting in the sides. Or the opposite, if you are using a full frame lens over a Super 35 sensor, you are only acquiring the middle part of the image. In fact, we could open the conversation about speed boosters and all that stuff. I wouldn't jump into that because the time is very limited, but bear in mind that here we are talking about the sensor size from the point of view of the camera. In front of it, you need to have a lens that is finally the one that will provide the focal distances and all the geometrical aspects of the image in combination with the sensor. Okay, so sorry, Paul, for jumping also.
No, that's fine. And I think looking at that large format sensor, that full frame sensor, all of those 4 cameras that we talked about earlier, the cinema line ones, all have that sensor, and they all have a variety of different ways of cutting into that image. You can take the full frame, or you can take a variety of different formats inside that, and it differs from one camera to another. But talking about the anamorphic side, just for people who don't understand what anamorphic is, and there are still quite a lot of people who don't, this comes from many, many years ago, where the idea of shooting anamorphic is to take the original image and you squeeze it down, traditionally to half its width, but there are other formats. Some people say you're stretching it this way, but it comes to the same thing. Basically, you're turning it from a rectangular frame into a squarer frame that actually fits onto the film frame, or in our case, into the sensor. And that's done with this anamorphic lens that's kind of bent in one direction, so it's magnifying in one direction and squeezing the image down. And that goes through post-production, and then in the cinema, you just go the other way. So that's where this idea came from, and the lens you can see there just stretches it back out again. So it allows you to have this really cinematic view, a wide picture on a relatively square frame like you would have in traditional film or on a sensor. And Venice and others support this idea. And in the Venice, we have both 4x3 and a 6x5 anamorphic modes. And there you can see the frame 4x3 and 6x5. And when that is processed, as you can see here, you get this final image that is effectively 3680 by 3024, so 8x3 and a 12x5 image. So you can see the width of those images there, nice wide cinematographic look. So that's the idea of anamorphic.
The thing about the anamorphic, it's very important to understand that it comes from an artistic point of view. When the anamorphic started many years ago, it was because the television was erupting on the homes of the people. So people started to not go to cinemas, started to watch movies at home because all the movies were 4x3, like the TV. So the cinemas decided to fight against the TV to do a wider image. So there are plenty of anamorphic feature like Todao or VistaVision, which is more bigger than CinemaScope and anamorphic. But at the end, many movies shot during the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s were shot in panoramic just because they wanted to show it beautiful in big screen. So most of the people most of the movies that we know, which we love, is shot in anamorphic. So the thing is, actually, the anamorphic thing, it's from a technical point of view, it's not that important. I mean, you can shoot 6K with the Venice and do a crop, and you have a beautiful wide image with a nice resolution. But the important thing with the anamorphic, it's the aestheticals of the lenses. Paul said that you need a lens, which is the squeeze and unsqueeze image, which gives you a very characteristic look. I mean, the reason for shooting anamorphic right now, mostly it's just because there are some very specific lens flare, there are some specific color fringing, and there's also the background when it's out of focus, it's like stretched. So when I shot anamorphic, 90% of the time is just because I love that kind of aesthetic. So it's not just
imperfections, finally.
Yeah, it's the bokeh, the out of focus little points of light. Instead of getting a circle, you get a kind of a donut shape.
Yep.
Yeah.
Very, very characteristic of anamorphic movies. It's a particular image quality.
Yeah,
and also
the thing is that I really want to point about that because many people ask, why do you shoot with anamorphic lenses? Because the anamorphic lenses are more expensive, bigger, it has a lot of aberrations, and also they are not very, it didn't have a good aperture. Most of it are 2.8 or something like that. So whether you want to shoot anamorphic, because everything's a problem. You can shoot a spherical and do a crop and put black bars if you need, and that's it. It's just for aesthetical reasons. It's just that.
So for people to recognize, despite the actual anamorphic lenses, I don't know if fortunately or unfortunately are very perfect and they look very, very spherical. If you take a look on a video and in the background, the typical highlights, as Paul was saying, instead of being like a circle, they are like a rugby ball.
Yeah.
Then that is anamorphic. And from now on, you will see that in many movies, and your eyes will go to the background instead of the foreground. Sorry for that. Also, coming back to this slide, this one is very important because we have seen especially in the last years, many people preferring the 6:5 aspect ratio for shooting anamorphic than the 4:3. And this is the reason. If you realize, we have much more, well, not much more, but we have more vertical resolution apart from the area that we are covering. the vertical resolution is better if we are acquiring or capturing the 6:5 aspect ratio before the squeezing, and that is why it's so important and so fancy. Sorry, Paul.
That is by the way, those two lines, that is a standard crop that they use, I think, quite a lot in movies and shooting 8:3. It's a standard crop, yeah. One interesting thing, just to finish off the whole story about anamorphic, is that I think there is some confusion with some of the terms. Spherical lenses. Now, I can remember with my stills photography days, we have spherical lenses and aspherical lenses. So you don't want to get confused between spherical lenses and anamorphic, and spherical lenses and aspherical lenses. It's a different story. So yeah, try not to get confused between the two.
So, sorry for my pronunciation about that.
That's not the pronunciation, it's the term, and Paul was using this term as well. Spherical lenses, we use it in conjunction with anamorphic, but there is also this discussion between spherical and aspherical lenses. These are the ones that have the strange shape on them to give you a really perfect image across the whole plane. Anyway, that's another story. Let's move on to the discussion between RAW and XAVC. And I put this table together to really kind of highlight the advantages and the disadvantages maybe of each type. And it's not to say that one is good and one is bad, but looking at the recording, generally speaking, RAW recordings are done externally. In all of our cameras, you have to add something to the camera to get it to record RAW. The media for RAW are fast, high density. There's a RAW recorder there. Whereas for XAVC, you can get around with just medium density media, normal media that doesn't cost perhaps so much. The file sizes for RAW are huge, whereas the file sizes for recording in video format like XAVC are easier to cope with. And the file organization, because you've got two files in most shoots, you've got maybe a proxy and a high res, you've got RAW and XAVC together, the complexity of the file system can get a little bit more complex than it will be with just one recording in XAVC. So the proxy capabilities with RAW, certainly if you're shooting something like a Venice, you've got RAW high res and XAVC proxy, and it's quite common to shoot RAW and the recording inside the camera, which is high definition, becomes the proxy file. And the whole quality then comes down when you go into something like ENG, where you're recording XAVC high res, and the proxies are tiny, tiny little files that you can send over the internet. So the whole level of what is high res and what is proxy jumps between a typical RAW shoot and something like an ENG XAVC shoot. Post-production simplicity, it's simpler with XAVC. There's a bit more complexity with RAW. It's not too complex, but it does increase in complexity. But the real advantage of RAW is in editing and grading flexibility. The colorist job, the stuff you can get out of RAW is much, much more. So if you really want to do things to the shoot, you want to change the color, you want to fiddle around with the dynamic range, you've got much more flexibility than you have with RAW. The skills that you need to do that, well, if you're a really good colorist, a lot of skill, high skill, then yes, use RAW, but you don't need those skills if you're shooting in XAVC. It's a kind of a simpler post-production process. The image quality for RAW, as I said, is superb. It'll give you the best image of all, but that's not to say that XAVC recordings are bad, and an awful lot of really good XAVC recordings come out of camera shoots. And the proxy quality, just comparing, it's going to be good quality in RAW because you're looking at an XAVC proxy. But the XAVC proxy, if you're looking on the other side, if you're looking at internal recordings using XAVC, the proxies are now tiny little files. And this is what we use with ENG. So the quality is okay. You can use it in emergencies, but you certainly wouldn't want to use that in a high quality shoot. So that's a kind of a summary, if you like, of what RAW is all about and how it compares to XAVC.
In fact, here in Sony, we have been recommending since years ago a workflow which is simply to ingest and edit in proxy quality and then render with the or do the relink with the highest quality ones. And also one little comment. Here we are talking about RAW, but obviously here in Sony we have the XOCN codec, which is equivalent, or well, you can testify that Paul Torrents, even better or equivalent to.
I shoot a whole movie with the XOCN. I can see it in Spanish better than in English.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I'll do plenty of different jobs. So from a movie, my last movie was shot on Venice and was shot in XOCN. But my last commercial was shot a few weeks ago with XABC, because most of the time if it's for me, I will go RAW all the time, for sure. But when I do like a big picture of the post-production of my productions, I have to look at all the chain. I mean, and sometimes I don't have the time and the resources to shoot everything in RAW, for example, with a documentary, or for example, with a commercial that is going to be shoot today and is going to be on TV tomorrow, something like that. So depending of the time, the resources, the money that we have for post-production, or even for the whole workflow, it could be a little bit complicated if we shoot RAW. So from time to time, I keep shooting XABC, because the highest version of the codec, it's pretty nice, even for color grading, if you shoot slog or even cinematone, if you want a specific look. And if I'm shooting a big project with time, with a DIT on set and a big post-production house, then I go for RAW, because I have the time, the money, and the expertise of the people. If not, for example, last commercial that I've shot, I didn't have time for anything, because we were shooting the commercial and 2 days after should be on TV. So I did the shooting. I didn't have time even for color grading almost. So I did a raw loot on camera. So we did like a fast thing to go through, and it worked pretty nice, and I'm very happy with the results of shooting XABC as well. So.
Probably now it's a good moment, because one of the questions that we received is what is the difference, for instance, when we talk about XABC, what is the difference between long GOP and intra? And to explain that very basically, and it is very important for your workflow, because for instance, an intra codec typically encapsulates each frame alone, let's say. So there is imagine 1 pixel, which is pretty similar to the ones that are surrounding it. So it's very easy to encode the differences, the spatial differences between 1 pixel and the surrounding ones. And then that way we can divide the image in blocks, and that way we can encode. But the XABC long GOP, despite it compresses much more the video workflow or the file, it needs to have some time prediction in both senses, let's say. So for instance, if you have one intra frame and you have another intra frame, you need to interpolate or invent what's in the middle, basically. So for that, your system, your editing system, needs to be, let's say, intelligent enough to recompose the intermediate frames. This is quite similar to when you are working in audio with a WAV format or with an MP3 format. WAV format is sample by sample, and it's very easy to understand, because you simply read a sample and you reproduce it. Read a sample, play it, read a sample, play it. But with MP3, you need some time. There's a window, a slot of time that you need to analyze so that the system can recombine and recreate the frequencies that were lost. Therefore, the file in WAV will weight much more than in an MP3, but the system to play it back needs to be much more, let's say, intelligent with an MP4 than with a WAV. That is the same with an intra or a long GOP. So be very careful, because sometimes a bigger file doesn't necessarily mean that your system is going to suffer from moving all those contents. So
yeah, that's important, because if you're doing a small production and your computer to do the post-production, it's not a big one, it's maybe it's like a portable computer or a small computer, instead of using the smaller file, you should use the bigger one. I mean, if you have the chance of going intra or long up, go intra. The files will go bigger, but it will be easier for the computer to compute.
Yes,
I think yeah, the big difference between intra-frame and long GOP is that in long GOP you are comparing frames together before you compress. So the actual compression is pretty similar between the two, but with intra-frame, you're taking each frame and compressing it on its own, one after another. But in long GOP, you're comparing two frames together, and then you're compressing the difference. And because most video, the difference between each frame is very, very small, you're compressing something that's easy to compress. So you get less data, but for the same quality overall. And the idea of a GOP stands for group of pictures. That's how much you are comparing the frames before you start the whole process off with another iframe, another frame that you're not comparing. And so that's the difference. And it's that comparison that can reduce the amount of data overall without necessarily reducing the quality. But Paul is right. Overall, you get better quality with iframe. But you can reduce the amount of data considerably in your file sizes if you use long GOP. So which is better? I think it depends what you're shooting.
Yeah, exactly. It depends on the workflow. Yeah.
Yeah.
And now one of the typical things that we are finding in nowadays, a typical conversation is about HDR. In fact, many people talk about 4K, and I think that we can agree that resolution nowadays is not a problem. And probably most of us are not really worried about that, provided it has the, let's say, today 4K is almost a must for a feature-proof camera. But I think that most of the people is not getting very crazy about the resolution, because that is something that we have suffered in the past. We jumped from SD to HD. Now we are jumping from HD to 4K. Okay, no worries. But there is something much more important, and in fact in Sony we used to say that it's not a matter of more pixels but better pixels, and that includes the term of HDR. But there is a little problem. For instance, if you are working with a camera like this, or the FS7, or in this case it's the FX9, there is a little problem that you have, that you are shooting in most of the cases with HDR, with the gamma curve you choose, preferably slog3, but it depends also on the environment. But the way to monitor that is crucial, because most of the cameras, as of today, I think that all of them have a monitor that is SDR. So despite, in spite of the resolution, it works under the 709 recommendation, meaning that it cannot reach the same latitude or the same stops as the sensor. So how to monitor? And in these cameras, there is a very useful tool that we have, which is the high key, low key. You will see many people assigning that function to a button in the grip, and that way, what the camera does is to deliver the 7 highest stops to the screen, or the 7 lowest stops of your picture to the screen, and that way you can see if the image is overexposed or the low level is also busted or is.
I'll use it all the time. It's my main tool of exposition right now, Because as Alvaro said, if you have a camera with a wide dynamic range and you have an SDR monitor and a regular one, you are only watching the medium part, and you need like HDR monitors with conversions to see all the image that you are capturing. Thinking as digital capture as like a raw capture, even if you're not shooting raw, if you're shooting XABC in SLOG3, you're shooting a lot of data and you are watching just the middle of it, or you're watching all the data, but in a log way, so it's so difficult to understand the exposition. So at the end, you have a lot of stops and you're watching the middle of those. So if you press the high key, then you see the high part, and then low key the lowest part. So you can see 7 stops of the center, then 7 stops of the high zone, and then 7 stops of the lowest part.
Low lights.
With the low lights. So just with the press of a button, you can see if you are really overexposed or you're really underexposed. I'll use it all the time. It's my main tool right now.
And also
it's so simple to use, isn't it? It's just 3 presses, and you can check the top, you can check the bottom, and you know when you go back to normal, you've got the whole image there. It's so simple, so powerful.
It's very interesting to have a good understanding which curve are you using to do the monitoring of that. Probably something like a 709 or something like that with 7 or 8 stops, and then watching to the waveform, because I use the high-low key with the waveform, so you really know where is the clipping part. I tend to do a lot of the theory of the right exposure. You expose everything to the right on a histogram, as said, and I'll do it most of the time using the waveform. I mean, I put the camera on high key, and then I look for the brightest part to be just in the limit of overexposing, and stop down the diaphragm or put some NDs on camera just to keep that highlight, and then everything exposed to down to the blackest part. So
do we have those pictures there, and we can show? Is that on the next page?
Sorry. So
so that's it in normal, and then if you set it up on the signable button, you press the button once, and the whole picture goes right down, so you can see the bottom, and you can see that green area there. Now normally that would be burnt out on a Rec 709 monitor, on a viewfinder, completely gone. You press it again, and now you can check the shadow areas. And so these simple pictures here are kind of showing you what it would look like on the camera. Then we press it a 3rd time, it goes back to normal, and you know in your head that those highlights and those lowlights are still captured in the camera, even though you can't see them on the viewfinder or the monitor. It's really, really useful.
That helps a lot to the lighting of the image, because for example, with this image of the arc, probably in a regular situation, I will look if in the part of the upper left, if I have to put light there. But if I push low key, sorry, I can see that there's still image there, so I can do a mass compost production, and I don't need to put additional lights there to bring it up. So because the camera is already recording that.
Apart from that, obviously, I would say that in all our cameras, we have the gamma display assist in some cameras. In other ones is auto gamma or something like that. I don't remember the term, which is basically applying a technical lookup table. So it is converting from typically SLOG3 into 709. Remember that there are 2 kind of lookup tables. Some of them are technical, like this one, like this example, and the other ones are the typical artistic ones in which you can load something into the camera. Many people were doing that with the FS7, for instance. You upload something in the camera. It's a matrix that converts the original image into another thing. And then thanks to that, you can see more or less how the final image of that take is going to look like, because that comes typically from post-production.
There's one thing with the gamma assist curve, because most of the cameras, it has lookup tables, so you can bring your own lookup tables. I really love, for example, the LC709 LA. That's a
yes.
Yeah, LC709A. I love that curve from the FS7. But with the gamma 6 curve, it's a very aggressive curve, which is a direct extract from the S-Log to 709. And people tend to think that it's a very ugly curve, but there's one thing with that curve. If you make the image beautiful with a gamma 6 tool, the S-Log it will be awesome.
Yep.
I mean, because you're doing the light for 6 or 7 stops, and if you have a wider range, when you go to post-production, the images will be gorgeous.
Also, a little tip. Just a moment, Paul. Sorry. There is a bunch of lookup tables that we have been working with together with Technicolor that you can download from our website, and it's really worth taking a look on it because it's really, it can provide or help you a lot, especially with that artistical part of the image.
So I was just going to say, to remind people, I'm just trying to remember which cameras have all these features. So the high-low key we have in Venice, we have in the FX9, I think, and the FS7. Does that have it?
FS7. Yeah, FS7 was the first one, I think.
No, I think it was.
Venice was the first one, wasn't it?
No, the high-low key it was on the F5 and F5 as well.
Yeah.
Okay, but you know, for any users out there that have any of these cameras, look out for this menu. The high-low key definitely is really useful. But some of these other gamma curves that Paul has been talking about, experiment with them, try them out in a shoot. That some of them are very, very useful and very creative.
Yep. Well, for instance, these are our social media, because now we are going to talk about a bit more about our cameras and all that stuff. But I will leave meanwhile this little reference to our social media. I especially recommend, obviously, following Director de Fotografía or Paul in social media. He has a very, very nice blog. And for instance, in my case, I try to do my best with my videos about how to learn some things about that Sony cameras. But now let's go, if you agree with that, with some questions on some aspects that were recently commented. So let me stop sharing my screen, because probably it's better to see our faces, not mine, but our faces in big size. And one thing that was told, I think that 1 week ago, is the capability in both FX6 and FX9 to output 4K RAW at up to 120p output. And it was 1 week ago. It will be version 2.1 and 1.1, depending on if it is FX9 or FX6, respectively. And I think that Atomos announced yesterday or the day before that they are going to launch the Ninja B Plus, which is going to be capable of ingesting and recording and showing that material. So as you have seen from the beginning, especially when we were talking about RAW, it's something that we usually output from the camera and needs to be recorded through either a recorder, like in Venice, for instance, you have the R7, which is the one that you attach to the camera and you can record RAW or XOCN, or for instance, in the FS5, you have the RAW output directly through the SDI connector, or in FS7, you needed something like this, which is also equivalent to the one we have in FX9. So you have a RAW out here, and that is directly decoded, because it's encoded and encrypted via, in this case, Atomos devices. That is one of the things. And also there is going to be a version 3, which I consider very interesting for the FX9. As we were talking in the beginning, especially in broadcast, the way to work is usually through a B4 lens over a 2/3 inches sensor. And that is more or less equivalent to a Super 16 sensor size. And that is something that was pretty demanded from the FX9, because maybe you remember that we had that for the FS5, we had the same for FS7, because the sensor in those cameras, it was Super 35, 4K. So if you crop it to Super 16, it could keep the full HD resolution. But there is a big difference in this case between the FX6 and the FX9. Remember that the FX6 is a full frame sensor, but it is 4K resolution, while in the FX9 we are oversampling because the sensor is 6K, and then we are outputting 4K. But if we reduce to Super 35, it is still 4K. And that way we can even reduce more the sensor area, we can crop it, and we can get full HD, which in that case would be Super 16. And that is something that I understand that cannot be done unless we interpolate and we, we upconvert into 4K in an FX6. So be careful, because if you are going to work, or your project is thinking about using Super 16 lenses, it is better to think about the version 3 of the FX9. So be very careful with that. That is one of the questions. So FX9 obviously is not the same sensor as FX6. And I remember having a similar conversation when the FX9 was launched. Many people was telling, okay, full frame, more than 15 stops, dual ISO, we can talk about that. So what's about? What is the difference between an FX9 sensor and a Venice sensor? And obviously it's not the same, despite it shares some features, but it is very, very different. And talking about the dual ISO, let me try to put here a little
There's one thing I've shot with all of the cinema line from FX3 to Venice, and most of the camera are different between each other. I mean, in color and resolution and everything, and it's not bad. I mean, are different cameras. So many people thought that FX9 and Venice, it was the same sensor, and if you shoot with both, you can match it, because at the end you can match doing tweaking of color and everything, but you can see at the first look that it's a different camera.
Yep. And also a different.
I can't remember, guys. Can the FX9 achieve a 2020 color space? Can it capture the 2020?
Yeah, because in fact, let me show this scheme here. Good moment to show it. I don't know if you can see it big enough, but for instance, one of the typical things that we recommend, maybe you remember that in FX9 or FS7, you can shoot in SGAMO 3 or SGAMO 3.cine. Depending on who are you going to deliver your production to, it's recommended to go into one color, not color space, color capturing area, or the other one. So for instance, if you are going to deliver into 2020 some OTT, like let's say Netflix, for instance, that is the green triangle that you can see there. So you could capture with the yellow triangle, and then via the saturating, you can totally lay over the 2020 recommendation. But if you are going to work for cinema purposes using the P3 color space, or for TV with the 709 recommendation, then it is better to go into the red triangle. Why? Because via the saturation, you can reach the gray triangle, which is P3, or the blue triangle, which is 709.
But also with the S-gamut, it's not only just the saturation, but you have to tweak as well.
That is the problem, that if you acquire with, for instance, the yellow triangle for providing P3 material, for instance, for cinema, which is the gray triangle, you need to desaturate, but also provide a hue to the color space. And that, in terms of processing in post-production, is a very big sacrifice. So that is why we strongly recommend from the beginning to choose the proper color space. So that is one of the things related to sensors. And another one, probably I'm going to cover my own face, but I think it's worth, obviously, which is about the dual ISO. This is something that we have launched officially, both in Venice and in FX9. The base ISO values are different because, for instance, in Venice, you have 500 and 2500 base ISOs. In FX9, which this diagram belongs to, is 800 or 4000. But what is that used for? Imagine that you need, due to the situation or the lighting of the image, you need to go to 2000 exposition index. That you can reach that red rectangle from 800 ISO in the left or 4000 ISO in the right. In the left, you need to increase your signal. So probably you will do that via gain, for instance. And in the right side, you need to decrease your signal, which I recommend to do via the ND filters. In the end, in both cases, you will have 2000 in exposure index. But if you take a look on what happens referred to the horizontal line that crosses the diagram, which is the middle gray, in the left side, you will have something like 7 or 7.5 stops above it and 7 stops and a half below it. While in the right side of your screen, you can see that you have 5 stops over the mid-gray and 10 stops below the mid-gray. So, for instance, if you're going to shoot low lights in a low light environment, it is recommended, despite you can do whatever you want, obviously, to use the highest ISO of the camera. But if you are going to work in a very oversaturated or a very light environment, in that case, it's better to jump from the lower base ISO.
I did a lot of tests about that because I'm very worried about how it worked, and I can show you something very quick. And go to webinar is not the best place to show anything with image quality, but this is the same image. I'm going to put myself higher. This is the same image with 2000 ISO. One is 800, the other is 4000. It's shared with the FX9, and you can see that the exposure looks very different, being the same ISO, being the same f-stop. Everything is the same. Just one thing is shot on base 800, and the other is base 4000. The thing it's very different. It's very different because there's nothing on the gray point. I mean, the plant, the Audrey plant, it's on the shadow area, and the background it's on the high area. So it's a slug. That's it. I can show if you want another day the results post-production with post-production. But the thing is very important to understand that if you shoot one base ISO or the other, it will affect the whole image. So you have to take care about that for exposing that, because you're going to get significant different results on shadows and highlights. On the midtones, it should be very similar.
And also bear in mind that we have the dual ISO officially both in Venice and FX9, but not in FX6. For instance, in FX6, there is something called enhanced ISO that works similarly, but it doesn't keep the same quality, let's say picture quality in both base ISOs. So that is why we cannot call it officially a dual base ISO, because the noise level are different. But if you increase the ISO in an FX6, you will see a moment in which suddenly the image changes and suddenly the noise reduces because it jumps to the secondary circuit of the sensor.
That happens also with the FX3, and you can see, I can remember the number. We should do more tests about that. But I think if you go to 10,000 ISO, you have noise, and then you go one step further and you go like 12,800, and the noise is lower than 10,000, because it changed the circuits. But it works different than the dual ISO, which is in the FX9 and the Venice, you can tweak it by hand.
I think that's the important thing to remember with dual base ISO, and just basically repeating what Alvaro has already said, is that it's actually changing the way the sensor works to give you more sensitivity with the same quality, whereas with the lesser cameras, the smaller cameras, it's got this high sensitivity setting. It's not the same. It's not doing it actually in the sensor itself, and that's the important difference. And you know, the more expensive cameras are more expensive for a reason. And that is one of those reasons. With dual-based ISO, it is a very different kind of processing to give you this extra quality, but with a higher sensitivity.
Okay, so we are running out of time, unfortunately, because you know that I love this kind of chats.
Should be 2 hours, really.
Yeah. In fact, well, it wouldn't be a strange, for instance, for Paul to rent and myself. You know, there are many things that we would like to discuss about, and probably we will set another webinar. But now what we are recommending you is to join the next webinar that will take place in the middle of May well, this month is ready. For May, yeah. So it's how to pick the right camera lens to find your needs. There are going to be much more webinars. Of course, you can recall this webinar because it's being recorded. And also, when we end this webinar, when we press the stop button, please, you can simply tell us what is your opinion. There's a little survey. I was going to say a poll, but I think we have plenty of polls today. And also, you will get access to the materials, to some materials that may help you to understand and to learn more, or even to share with us. Because in my case, I'm learning a lot every time we talk. You know that is something that you shouldn't stop doing ever. And also, of course, you are invited to join us via social media, via any of the media that we have. And now I will shut up because I think now it's time. As a final matter, thank you very much to all the attendees, because giving us an hour of your time is something that is really worth. That is something we really appreciate. And especially no need to say to both Pauls, because I'm in love with you and I love this kind of things, of conversations, and be sure that I learn a lot with you. And now is your time. I leave the mic for you.
Paul?
Nothing much I can say. Thank you all for coming. I wish, like my colleagues here, that we could speak for 2 hours or 3 hours. We certainly could do if we were sitting over a pint. That would be easy as anything, but we have to cut it off at some point. So, you know, thank you all for coming. We'll have a pint together, the three of us, at some point in the future.
Yeah, for sure.
For sure. I want to thank also the crew that you cannot see, which also help us to set this webinar, because they spend a lot of time with us, and also all the people who's coming to hear us, and especially Paul and Alvaro, which are, I consider them friend of mine. So it's a pleasure to share time with you.
Okay, so again, thank you very much. And I think that one of the persons that is hardly working behind the scenes, Florence, maybe you can stop right now. And thank you, everyone, and see you in the next time. Okay. Gracias.
Cheerio. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.